welcome to Module 3, Ancient Traditions of Higher Learning. Now, most of you are aware, and you would be reasonably critical, of our Western bias in higher education research, or actually in research in most areas of most universities. And this is 1 week that we get to challenge that Western bias and remember that higher learning existed for thousands of years before the Western university, often in very developed ancient civilizations. And Europe is only one of those civilizations. But because the European model came to dominate the 19th and 20th centuries, it can be really difficult for us to get sort of behind or beyond the Western European model. So there are 2 readings about Europe for this week, but you're only going to choose one of those. Instead, you're going to read 3 readings that are not about Europe. I want you to look at the other ancient traditions: India, Islam, China, the Aztec and Mayan colleges. Pick something that gets you excited about something outside of the Oxfords and Cambridges. And this is actually a distinct part of this course. We try to look back before the European university to understand how higher education existed in other civilizations, because we want to ask, what echoes of that might we still be able to see today? And often, when we find that higher learning traditions in the past are connecting with us, it's because they have these deep cultural, philosophic, or religious foundations. And this is quite different than the Western university. In the European context, functionalist sociology, modernization, and Marxism, these were 3 moves that led to the secularization of universities, the removal of religion or spirituality. And in fact, Marx, his contemporaries, and many who came after him, they believed that this would pervade all of social life. They believed that secularization would happen across society as we became more advanced and developed. But the collapse of the Soviet Union really brought an awareness of the importance and the persistence of religion. So religion had been removed from state operations. It had been banned from social life in the USSR. But when it split apart, religion sprang up everywhere. It was still deeply valued by people. And this highlights one of our main questions in this class: what persists? What deeply held beliefs, what values continue in spite of colonial occupation, educational borrowing, or political trends? And this brings us to a term you're going to hear a lot in this course: civilizations. This term was made famous by Samuel Huntington in his 1994 paper, Clash of Civilizations. He wrote this paper in response to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because when the Soviet Union dissolved, it was the end of what they had called the Cold War, this economic and military race between 2 superpowers: the US on one hand, with its belief in free market capitalism, and the USSR on the other hand, with its strong state-led communism. And this fight in political ideology, it was at the center of international relations in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. So, I mean, think about it. If you had had an academic career, you could have had your entire academic career within this paradigm when this was the norm. And in the realm of education, actually, this Cold War shaped so much of what was happening around the world with international education. In 2003, I studied in Ghana, West Africa. That was my study abroad in undergrad. And at the time, we had this wonderful professor. He was in his 70s, and he spoke fluent Russian because he had been given a scholarship by the Russian government to study in Moscow in the 1960s. So on all fronts, the USSR and the US were fighting. And when Huntington writes The Clash of Civilizations, he's writing after this battle has ended. He argues that the new battle, this new divide, will not be political ideologies, but deep civilizational roots. Things that come from our culture, our beliefs, our religion, our ways of life. And ironically, the United Nations declared 2001 the year of dialogue among civilizations. And it was the same year of 9/11 when many people said that Huntington's predictions had come true. So what is all of this? This is to remind us, when we look at things like colonialism, consider what has persisted. Yes, there were oppressive Western norms imposed on countries around the world. a university model with very specific features that was exported around the world. But what has persisted from local cultures and local values in spite of that? Think of this as layers of activity. There's this modern, secular, rational systems of finance and economics, technology. These all operate in a functionalist model. They pretend they're neutral and they spread an education model that works, universities that build national development. But there are many people, often those from non-Western nations, who are shouting, we have different cultural, spiritual, social dimensions, and you are ignoring these. So hopefully you're beginning to see the purpose of this course. How can we rethink the spread of the Western university model? How can we begin to look deeper at how it was adapted or shaped by non-Western traditions? Where did the values align? Where did they conflict? Are these ancient traditions still in people's hearts and minds, even if the institution is Western? So let's stop talking about the Western universities now. It's so all-pervasive. And let's think of things that happened years before the Oxfords and the Parises. We actually, in our Western model, we owe so much to other knowledge traditions. During the Dark Ages of Europe, it was the Islamic scholars who preserved the great Greek texts that were going to go and evaporate during the Dark Ages. Things like Aristotle, Socrates. The Islamic tradition also developed much of the knowledge we have of physics, optics, medicine that inform our scholarship today. And the early sciences of China and China's examination system for the civil service, these were admired by explorers and they were actually brought back to Europe. So we owe so much to these other ancient civilizations and their traditions. So the first reading we have from a different civilization looks at ancient Indian higher learning. This reading is by Anant Sadashiv Altekar, and he was actually the head of ancient Indian history and culture at Banaras Hindu University. And he kind of was the coolest. He worked in the early 1900s, and he was the archaeologist who was actually responsible for excavating these ancient sites of higher learning. He's famous for finding some of the oldest pillars with inscriptions from ancient India. So when you read this article, and when he says, we have evidence that Taxila was an educational center, like imagine him in the dirt, examining old stone tablets and making that conclusion. Listen to his stories because he was there. In this article, he's going to describe 3 centers of learning, Taxila, Banaras, and Nalanda. So read through this article. It's very interesting because Taxila, for instance, was continually conquered by invading powers. Its archaeological site is actually in present-day Pakistan. So think of that as this corridor for movement, for conquering powers during that time. The early archaeology shows that it was already a very important center of learning by the 7th century BCE. Unlike European universities, it wasn't sort of located just within an institution. It was individuals that had followers. Scholars and their mentors were very, very close. They often lived together, and there was a huge curriculum. We're talking incredible amounts of knowledge. Our modern universities would love it. Medicine, archery, the Vedas, grammar, philosophy, astrology, astronomy, accountancy, commerce, agriculture. I mean, everything we have, they had it and more. And these masters who taught were often linked or connected to temples, so Buddhist and Hindu traditions, so very important in this area. But by 250 CE, Taxila has largely vanished. And when the Chinese monk Fa Xian comes in 500 AD, the place was destroyed. It was only memories of the past. So enjoy this reading. So Altekar also describes Banaras in northeastern India and Nalanda, which is on the border with Bangladesh. Banaras was supported by famous rulers like Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal. But Nalanda, on the other hand, was a huge operation with elaborate buildings, 5,000 students, and it was supported by 200 villages. You might have heard the term Nalanda before. It's had this sort of reopening and regeneration, which is really exciting. Amartya Sen, the famous economist, was one of the early chancellors there in, I think, 2010. And it's trying to distinguish itself as an institution that's socially conscious and a place of the social sciences and humanities, which is an exciting thing in a world that's STEM crazy, right? And the idea of it is it's drawing on cultural roots to say, so one last thought on early Indian higher learning. Where were the women? Well, in early years, under the strong Hindu influence, women were encouraged to study the Vedas, and many of the early poetry was written by women. women were educated until 16 years. But as the centuries moved on and marriage became younger and younger, women were excluded from education. In Knowledge Across Cultures, a book by Dr. Hayhoe, there's a chapter by Rajagopal on the early women philosophers in India. It's a great read. If that's an interest for your paper, look at the additional readings. More important conquests by the Muslim and British reduced women's positions even further. And the additional readings have more on this if you're interested. There's a wonderful scholarship on female participation in India and China historically. So now let's move on to higher learning and Islam. As I mentioned earlier, the Islamic tradition has not received enough attention in the histories of European universities, even though they actually owe so much of their current scholarship to the Islamic universities. So these ran through North Africa and through the Middle East at the MENA area. And between the 9th and 11th centuries, the Islamic universities on all sides of the Mediterranean made these pioneering development that shaped modern research, medicine, teaching. They had a really strong written tradition. So there were incredible libraries. I've got a picture of one here that were developed, preserving and translating ancient texts. The only remaining one of these ancient universities is Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and it is still functioning. The two readings on Islam are really fascinating. Nagastine explores the 800 to 1350 timeframe, and the early Islam that he describes is really dedicated to the search for new knowledge. It's very tolerant of different ideas. When the Islamic conquest came through Syria and Persia, the Arabs were welcomed as liberators because they were actually more open in their philosophies, their belief, and their interaction with the world. The main subjects connected with these institutions were medicine, mathematics, astronomy, technology, and philosophy. And the Nestorians were also very important in this era. They were a sect of Christianity, and they worked on translating knowledge all the way to China. Through the openness of the Islamic rulers and institutions, the Hellenistic, Hindu, and Persian scholarship was actually preserved. It was not destroyed. So we can see these Islamic institutions in the Middle East as the great keepers of knowledge, bringing people in, being these spaces of debate. So in so many ways, the Islamic scholars took over from the ancient Greeks. They developed this incredible wealth of different traditions, preserved beautifully, and the medieval universities were able then to draw on that. The Kadi reading also explores Islamic higher learning, looking at the development of madrasas, also showing how they were not radicalized in their early years. So enjoy these readings. And the final reading that I will review for you today is Ruth Hayhoe's Lessons from the Chinese Academy. So it's a really brilliant analysis of how China drew on the German, French, American, and Soviet models as they developed their higher education systems. However, in the end, the model they did develop was distinctly Chinese, a distinctly Chinese cultural institution. You'll notice in this reading that she uses ideal types, which is what we call a Weberian or a Holmes-based framework, to say, what is the nature of this phenomenon? Really exploring the literature to get the features, and then to compare whether it's a match with a new type of institution. In China, before the 1900s, there were two very different modes of higher learning. The Shuyuans, which were connected to Buddhism. Now, these were often far away from major cities in remote places. And they were small academies of learning and were very different than the large imperial examination system. That examination system was often envied and imitated by new nation states in Europe. The early Jesuit missionaries who first documented the examination system considered it a very attractive model for Europe. Within China, there was a close relationship between higher learning and the state when it related to civil servants. So all the important European values of autonomy, intellectual freedom, they made no sense in this context. There wasn't this desire to be separate from the state. So Ruth points out that there was a high level of intellectual authority that scholars had. They were valued for their authority, but they worked in the name of the emperor. And they had actually more power than scholars in Europe. They didn't have a freedom to critique from a safe distance like those in Europe. It's very different nature of how academics related to the state. The Shuyuans, on the other hand, were away from the city. They were detached and they were often funded outside of the empire. And these provided spaces for dissidents or political active people to debate and discuss. Now, when we look at the medieval universities, they actually had one central discipline, one central subject that became sort of this unifying subject. And that was theology, very much related to the monks and the monastic contemplation of scholarship, contemplative life. Instead, within the Chinese context, the transcendent disciplines and the mundane were actually seen as complementary parts of a universe that was an organic unit. So the task of the scholar was really to awaken and actualize the goodness immanent in human nature. Tu Weiming was a Harvard professor and a leading figure who introduced Confucianism to the West. And this was in response to the dilemma of enlightenment, which really turned all of our sort of our intellect and our philosophy into what we call instrumental rationality. It has a job at the end of it. We have a purpose. Everything can be applied. And it was very much linked to this idea of individual liberty, calculated self-interest, and material progress. And so he began to use Confucianism to say, we can actually begin to see society differently. We can begin to engage with knowledge differently. And there's a great quote: the Confucian way is a way of learning to be human. Learning to be human is the Confucian spirit, is to engage oneself in a ceaseless, unending process of self-transformation. So this idea that we're looking at the whole person, and for those of you in student services, this should begin to resonate with you, because what we do in a lot of our residence life, our student development theory, is saying, how can we make these students whole people? And maybe we're working within a secular institution that wants them to become sort of econs who go out and get a job, and yet to think broadly about the philosophical foundations of higher learning, to say that it hasn't always been like this, and that something like Confucianism has been able to offer a whole view of making people human, which I love. So in the end, we do have 2 readings on the medieval university. And for those of you who have not taken 1803, you need to focus on the medieval university, because as much as I want us to think outside of it, it is foundational to a lot of what we do in this program. So did you like Rashdall's article, his essay called "What is the University?" So Hastings Rashdall was a scholar at Oxford in the late 1800s. And so if you had trouble reading his paper, that's not on you. It is 130 years old. And I feel like you might get to these words, sacerdotium, imperium studium, and you might throw your computer across the room. Or perhaps you loved his language. He does say the university is worthy of the same serious investigation which has been abundantly bestowed upon the papacy and the empire. And so I love that we're getting into writing from a person who was in an institution hundreds of years ago and can show us what it was like. So often we don't have that knowledge. So as a historian, I love this. And the overall purpose of his paper is to look at medieval Europe in the 13th and 14th century and begin to see what was unique about the medieval institution. And one of the big things we still have today is a charter. The charter protected the institutions from the political influence of the empire. So U of T still has a charter. So in all of these readings about the medieval university, we want to begin to ask, what echoes can we see today? Another thing in the medieval university was that you defended your subject orally. You would stand up before people and you would have a question and answer time where you would defend. And of course, when we finish our PhD in the Canadian context, we have an oral defense, and it's still called that. So all of these echoes that we see from the medieval university still exist. But of course, our range of subjects has dramatically changed. We are no longer just sort of law, philosophy, and theology. So those are your readings for today. Head out, enjoy them, pick ones that get you excited. I did not overview the Aztec reading, but for those of you who want to look at it, it's a good one as well. The Aztec colleges actually had the concept of zero long before the Arabic mathematicians did. So very interesting, but less transfer of the knowledge outside. It's really cool. Okay, have fun doing your learning portfolios, and I will see you in class. Bye.